Hello and welcome. Hi, everybody. Look, tonight, our first show for the year, we're joined by Berit Reiss-Anderssen. She was probably one of the best gifts of the new year for me. The chair of the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize Committee. She's a Norwegian defense attorney who's had broad litigation experience, both in criminal law, corporate crime, human rights issues. But I think what was most interesting about talking to her was, how values that were infused into every one of this, how she broke it down, how this program, Hold the Line, came down to those very same things. So please join me and welcome Berit Reiss-Anderssen. Berit, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Maria. Your work in Rappler was part of the reasons you being the awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So it's such an honor to actually be on the inside of your achievements and joining you in this show.
Well, first, of course, I thank you for this, but I think for everybody, I've heard you repeatedly talk about this, but there were many things that happened behind the scenes. I know you can't talk about them for 50 years, but could you tell us why now? Why us? Why is it so important for journalists to have gotten the Peace Prize?
Well, there's no short answer to that. So if you are patient and give me a few minutes, I will have to start with the requirements of the will of Alfred Nobel. That is our mandate to carry out his intentions for how peace can be achieved. And one of the reasons for awarding a person or an institution a peace prize is to create fraternity between nations. And we have a long tradition of giving peace prizes that support democracy, because we believe, and it is supported by research, that democracy is our best defense against war and conflict. Democratic states rarely go to war. It has happened, but they particularly don't go to war against each other. And what is a democratic state? Well, it's a myriad of things that have to be in place to establish a true democracy. But a human right in the center of democracy is the freedom of speech and freedom of information, because citizen participation in electing their leaders has to be on an informed basis. So you can say education is also a building stone in democracy. But freedom of speech is so essential. And our reasoning is, the reasoning of the Nobel Committee, is that the true warriors of freedom of speech are journalists. Not only transmitting this information to people, but also in their role in criticizing power. It is so essential for any opinion that is stated in society, or any manner that power is exercised, that it can be scrutinized and it can be criticized without severe consequences. And without journalism, we would not be able to create that very atmosphere of a well-functioning information flow and well-functioning criticism. Democracy simply cannot live without the role of journalists. So back to your question, why now? now because it could have been before, it could have been later, but now because we are in a time where the idea of democracy, in fact, is on the decline. We had in Europe an enormous optimism of democratic states as the Iron Curtain vanished, and a lot of Eastern European states joined the European institutions, developed democracy. This is on the decline in several nations. I believe it is the same in Asia, that there's so many examples of development in an authoritarian direction. And I believe this also has to do with media, that people are not only informed, but there's also a lot of disinformation, even propaganda that is transmitted through media, that make people believe in quick fixes, the processes that are part of democracy can sometimes be slow, sometimes even inadequate. And I think we need more than ever media as a watchdog. And I can imagine you as reporters and journalists, you do your everyday work, you bring out stories. With the Peace Prize, we wanted to remind you that there is a very great cause above your head that you also are working for in upholding a sane society and strengthening democracies.
It was an amazing, I mean, that moment when you announced this, I think every journalist around the world felt like their pain, their sacrifice, the mission, that this had somehow been recognized, because we've certainly seen the decline of press freedom and the attacks on journalists increasing over the last decade. So it came at a time, but Berit, I guess, how can we continue doing our jobs when just by doing our jobs, the very platforms that delivered the news are actually used to attack us, to weaken journalists? The stats, we talked about this, the stats of social media platforms, and the research shows that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts. And among the first targets in almost every democracy in the world have been the journalists trying to hold power to account. How do you deal with this? The way the technology has been shaped now actually encourages hate, that the kind of the worst of humanity. And most of that first turned against the journalist. What do you see happening?
Yes, and that is also an additional answer to why this Peace Prize came now, because the development of social media is something the world hasn't seen before. And what we are really talking about is using words as a weapon. Words as a weapon for peaceful causes, but also words as a weapon for destructive causes. Now, unfortunately, the latter we have seen in history on several occasions. Hate speech is as old as humanity, but the effect of social media, that's not necessarily only hate speech. More of it is polarized opinions and lies. And this is another factor. What is on the decline? The modern world has believed in science, truth that can be verified by certain methods. Now, there is also a decline in believing in science. So when we gave the prize to you and Dmitry Muratov from Novaya Gazeta, we underlined that what we support is quality journalism that defends truth. Now, truth is not a given static fact always, but there are ways to underline truth, which a journalist very well knows. Have your sources in place, verify your information, etc. And this is a contrast to social media. So what can we do? To support quality journalism is extremely important, and also for democracies to understand that the ownership of media houses, public support of the press, of the quality press, is extremely important to uphold a sound discourse in a society.
Given that the platforms that deliver the news, the facts, science to the public is actually geared towards triggering our emotions more than it is to trigger our rational thinking. It's thinking fast versus thinking slow. Where do you see this heading? I mean, how do you see this playing out, and what can we do to to minimize the negative impact of this? Is there any?
Well, I see it's heading in a very bad direction, because I see how public debate is moving away from public broadcasting platforms, away from nations. But I also see that people are, we engage a lot of our time in the social media platforms. And I think we really need a big public debate about what do the media platforms do for us. They take an enormous amount of time. You browse through one story after the other. As you say, it triggers our emotions. And it's like eating fast food instead of getting nutritious food. And I think we soon will see a reaction where people long for more solid intellectual nourishment. But it is extremely important that the quality journalism still is there as an alternative, and is there to criticize. And perhaps what you have not focused on enough is exactly the impact of social media in our way of life, in schools, how it invades our mind, the psychological effect of that. There's a big story to be told, Maria.
That's my greatest fear, is this kind of emergent behavior, how humanity at scale is being shaped by the technology to bring out the worst in who we are. We have elections coming up this year in many different countries around the world. The Philippines will be in exactly 99 days. I keep count, and then soon after that, Kenya. You have Brazil in October. Then, of course, the US, France is somewhere in between, and then the US in November. How can we have, as we're being manipulated, how can we have integrity of elections if we don't have integrity of facts?
That is so true. And where we started, how can you have integrity of elections if you don't have an educated population? Because everybody needs to make their decisions on an informed basis. So traditionally, we have perhaps been speaking about that more authoritarian states serve so much propaganda to their people that they are not really informed when they participate in so-called elections. But the disinformation in the modern world doesn't necessarily come from people in political power. It comes from social media that manipulates us. And it is in the center of what investigative journalism really should reveal and tell us. Somebody's trying to fool you. I believe in the cornerstone of democracy is really that we take the opinion of every person seriously. And I will, up to a certain extent, of course, defend everyone's right to have an opinion, however crazy or absurd that opinion is. I draw the line by hate speech and harassment and things like that, but opinions in themselves, we shouldn't really have censorship on. Opinions should be fought with other opinions, and that may sound naive, but it's the only sustainable approach, because when people start to believe that mainstream society, their leaders are fooling them, distrust is a reaction, and a society where the people don't trust their leaders, don't trust each other, it's heading for trouble, it's heading for anarchy, it's heading for unrest and reducing social order. And what we all need is stable societies where our children can go to school, where we can speak our minds, where a certain amount of healthcare and material conditions are in place for us. I think all people all over the world have these dreams, very basic dreams in common. It's called peace, by the way.
It's the goal, and it seems so much further away, given where we are today. Looking at things like, well, what we're seeing in the Ukraine or North Korea starting to do more missile launches, right? The world geopolitical power seems extremely unhinged, and I guess part of that is because what we have seen, information operations flowing through social media. So in this environment where democracies are being insidiously manipulated, where it's unclear what is fact, what is fiction. In the Philippines, for example, in September last year, we had Chinese information operations coming from China, attacking journalists, me and Rappler. It was also creating fake accounts for the US presidential elections, because this was September 2020, using AI generated photos. So it was all about deception, trying to incite hate, but it is connected to geopolitical power. How can we gain our agency back, and how can we demand accountability?
Well, first of all, by demanding accountability, because the trend is a tendency to interference, and there is a sort of cyber war going on, where exactly information and disinformation are the weapons. And to point out this interference is, first of all, really important that whoever feels that they have been interfered, whatever nation, that there is an investigation and that the culprit is pointed out. Of course, no nation will admit that they were in fact interfering. China will never admit that. Russia didn't admit that, in spite of pretty heavy evidence in interfering in the American elections. But it's also a tendency, since you mentioned Ukraine now, that any conflict becomes a proxy for larger geopolitical conflicts. Because what is the Ukrainian conflict about? A nation that Russia wants to prevent becoming a member of NATO, that hasn't applied for a membership, that hasn't been invited into a membership in NATO. And suddenly a principle is at play, not by Ukrainian politicians really, but by everybody else. So, and where everybody have taken their positions from the Cold War prior to 1992, and just acting out those cards. It's interesting to observe this. And what are we going to do? We have to, when these conflicts are on the rise, people are being told how dangerous the world is, how close Ukraine is from being invaded, how hard reactions NATO will give. So there's a war rhetoric. Perhaps the antidote is to say, calm down, bring your language down. There is no immediate danger at this point. And then everybody will scream, there is danger. Are you naive? Now, sometimes the danger is to escalate the rhetorics.
Those are some of the things that we miss. I mean, the leader that unites rather than pulls away, the leader that calls for calm rather than to create conflict. I guess, you know, we're coming up on the tail end. It's a world that's fraught with so many both new things and, as you mentioned, old conflicts, old power and new power not quite meeting eye to eye, and then the citizens in each one of the countries. I think early last year, Oxford University's Computational Propaganda Research Project said at least 81 countries had cheap armies rolling back democracies on social media. So where do you see hope? What should the road be ahead for us?
I see the hope. I believe in humanity that has the effort, when we are pressured, to solve the problems we have created, particularly when it comes to climate. We are in dire straits, but we will be able to solve it. And human beings have fantastic ability to mobilize when it is really necessary. And human beings can be taken for a ride for a certain stretch, and then the anti-reaction will come. People do seek truth because it gives them stability. And when you have been living under a regime of promises that are not fulfilled, you will react against that too. So the hope is really in our conversations and sharing ideas. It's our best weapon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Berit Reiss-Anderssen, joining us from Oslo. She is the former Vice Minister of Justice of Norway. She has had a long history fighting for rights, and now the chair of the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize Committee. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Maria.